Welcome to another episode of Rediscovering Conservatism, a webcast series that is jointly sponsored by New Direction and Fundación Civismo, where we seek to engage with some of the freshest thinking on the European right. And today we are delighted to be joined by Mr. Vondra, Alexandr Vondra. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello. Good evening or good afternoon.
Wonderful. This is being recorded as a conversation that will be released, and hopefully people will get to enjoy this at whatever time of the day that fits their schedule. Now, I'll just briefly introduce Mr. Vondra, who sat in the European Parliament since 2019 with the Civic Democratic Party, the Czech ODS, which has been a member of ECR for a while, and he joined the European Parliament after a long and really distinguished career at the highest echelons of Czech politics. Both in the communist period, where he was a leading dissident, but also in the brief period of the former Czechoslovak Republic, and then in the new independent Czech Republic. He's been involved for a long time, really, in politics, and he received a PhD in natural sciences, and he was one of the earliest signatories of the famous Charter of 77. He was imprisoned in the late 80s, in the waning days of communism in Czechoslovakia. He co-founded the Civic Forum along with the late Václav Havel, to whom he was also a foreign policy advisor for a number of years. And when in the early years of the new independent Czech Republic, he was a deputy minister for foreign affairs, and he was also an ambassador in Washington. So really an outstanding breadth of experience that covers a number of issues that we hope we'll be able to get to throughout our conversation today. But Mr. Vondra, I thought I would, before we get into some of the issues that have been a focus of yours lately, whether that is foreign policy and transatlantic relations or environmental issues, where you've been a very staunch critic of the so-called European Green Deal. Before we get into all of that, I wonder if we could maybe touch on one of the hottest items in the news cycle, which has been last week, the resolution, so to speak, of the disputes between Poland and Hungary on one side, and on the other, a coalition of countries that pretended to advance what they called rule of law by making COVID relief conditional on a certain set of demands. And of course, this didn't directly involve the Czech Republic, so perhaps we'll be talking more from a European perspective. But a lot of people from our political family saw this as really directly questioning the future of the EU. I was also very glad to learn that in the spring of 1990, you initiated a meeting of Czechoslovak, Hungarian, and Polish intellectuals and officials in Bratislava. That was one of the earliest iterations of the V4, which then became the V4, which really embodies what the kind of Europe that we believe in: subsidiarity, intergovernmentalism. So I wonder what were some of your main takeaways from what we saw last week, and how do you hope to keep making the case for an EU that respects the sovereignty of member states?
Look, no doubts that I can tell very openly what I think about this kind of a grilling of Poland and Hungary. To put it simply, I very much disagree with that kind of a policy. This conditionality, as they call this, to build the links between the so-called stage of the democracy or the rule of law in the member states on one hand, and on the other hand, to condition, to put the condition on the voting rights of the member states in the community, or even the money flow and the access to the funds. I think it's totally unfair. It has nothing to do with, in fact, the stage of democracy, because both Poland and Hungary are normal standard democracy with the free voting system. And what's happened is that EU in the last couple of years has been unfortunately hijacked by the socialists and the various type of sorts of the social engineers. Some of them call themselves liberals, although it has nothing to do with the original meaning of the word, at least in Europe, maybe not so much in the US, where it was hijacked already some times ago. And they simply dislike, those people dislike that the Hungarians and the Poles voted for the conservatives and that the conservatives are at the power. Yes, look, in Poland, it's a classic old time Catholic conservatism. In Hungary, it's a more kind of a national conservatism, but both are very legitimate currents. Unfortunately, it's very not very easy to detect some conservatives remaining in Western Europe. Maybe there are some of them in Bavaria. I hope that they would survive in the UK. So this is the problem. It's the problem that the establishment in Brussels and in some Western European capitals does not like who is in Warsaw and in Budapest in power, but they were elected. So it's unfair. You have mentioned that there was not so much solidarity within the Visegrad group this time. Yes, I was also very critical that the Czech government did not support them enough, but it's caused by simply the fact that the Czech government is now run by Andrej Babiš, who is a really populist leader. He's not a conservative, and he's a businessman who has a huge conflict of interest. He's in fact his core business is in the food industry and agriculture. He got the money from the EU, and thus, he was hiding behind the corner and did not want to become the target himself. And if he would be the target, then I think it's somehow legitimate because he's using the EU money to his own benefit. That's not definitely the case of Kaczynski government. It's even not the case of the Orban's government, but this is the case of the Czech government. So, and that's what they are trying to do, is to divide us. So they are not measuring everybody with the same, amount of criticism. For example, if the Hungarian government is critical about the immigration, it's immediately targeted. If Emmanuel Macron is critical the immigration, as we have seen in the last couple of months, there's nobody to target Macron. So it's a double standard, and we have to refuse this. And I would say that German presidency was somehow wise, that it mediated a solution which is at least for the time being to the benefit of everybody. So there is not any immediate push on Hungary and Poland as the result of that. But we have to count that they would try to repeat this over and over again until the establishment in Brussels is not going to change either his mind or itself as a person. And here, I think that Visegrad Group, as you rightly commemorated, it was an idea which was, in fact, for the first time promoted by Václav Havel in the spring of 1990. There was a time when still General Jaruzelski was the Polish president, so we had to wait with the official launch of that group until 1991, when Lech Walesa was elected for the president. That this Visegrad Group is very important, and one of our idea was that we in Central Europe should work together, not to build any kind of a vacuum in this part of Europe, because geopolitically it's very sensitive part of the continent, and that we have to work together. Otherwise, the neighboring powers either Russia or I can imagine even Germany in the past, it happened. That they are trying to occasionally play the games to post us against each other. And, if there is a conflict in this part of Europe, then for the biggers, like, for example, for Russia, it's easy to project its influence. And this is our lesson of history. I think Visegrad at least 3 times has showed its relevance in the past 30 years. It was during the NATO enlargement debate because it was thanks to, we were able to convince the Americans to enlarge NATO in a situation when French did not want to do this. The Germans were afraid, of Russia or etc. So it was American driven and proposed by Visegrad and upholding by Visegrad for the critical years of the early 90s. Secondly, we were very effective in convincing the Europeans, to uphold the energy security, just to add to those typical East-West gas and oil connection, to enrich them with the southern, the connections and pipelines in South-North connection. And that made us really independent out of this Russian type of blackmailing, which Ukraine is always the sacrifice. And thirdly, it was us who was the voice of the reason since the immigration crisis has emerged in 2015, and when many Western countries, including Germany, has extended its arms without taking all the consequences into account. So we, Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, were the voice of the wisdom and reason. And thanks to our uh, careful, realistic policy, we were able to convince the rest of the EU that just an open art policy is not the way forward because it could really destroy Europe from within if it is upheld just without any control and based on the illegal immigration. It had also the security component, as we can see time to time when the terrorists are striking in Germany, France, Belgium, and elsewhere. So it means that Visegrad is important. And certainly, there are those in Brussels who are trying, to convince the weaker parts of Visegrad, like some Slovaks and the Czechs, that Visegrad is toxic, you should give up that. No, it's not toxic. It's a very important strategic community, and we should stay behind.
This is an incredibly comprehensive answer, and I'm so glad you brought up so many of the interesting topics you brought up, and some of them we'll be coming back to over the course of our time. And it's really interesting. You started off with trying to expose some of the double standards and the way that the kind of the federalist consensus that has now taken hold of the EU institutions, but also the major parties in the parliament, EPP, Social Democrats, Greens, Liberals, how it is more important now than ever to have a viable alternative, such as ECR and yourself in the parliament, to counter that sort of consensus. And I'm glad you also drew, you exposed double standards with other cases, such as it only becomes a problem when the governments that are put on the spotlight are conservative. It really cuts across partisan lines, and I think a growing number of Europeans, not just in Central Europe but in other parts as well, are waking up to the realization that this was really a partisan plot. So I'm really glad you started off there, and obviously the memorable story of the V4 and what the V4 really tries to do, which is the sort of collaborative mechanism that respects the self-determination and the independence of nation states. And we hope that it will be a template for the kind of EU that we believe in. I wanted to turn to maybe another issue where you've also been very vocal. You're the editor of a fascinating compendium of essays with Severo, the institute in Prague, where you asked a question that is also increasingly important for ECR and that is really philosophically legitimate, which is whether environmentalism has to be alarmist. If I understood if I translated the title from Czech correctly, and I wonder, you've also been very critical of the Green New Deal in the plenaries and in the Parliament. You also you co-authored recently, I believe, well, actually a few months ago, shortly after the pandemic hit, a letter to the Commission urging for the postponement of the Green New Deal in light of the costs of COVID and the fact that the Green New Deal is going to be even costlier than it already was supposed to be now that COVID is impoverished European economies throughout. So what can you tell us maybe of how you're looking at environmental issues, whether your thinking has evolved on the European Green New Deal, and what does it say? I mean, it seems as though the Commission is just unwilling to re-examine the costs of the Green New Deal, even in the wake of COVID. What does that kind of attitude say about environmental alarmism?
Now, look, I have spent last 30 years of my professional career mostly dealing with the security and foreign policy issues. But once I was elected into the European Parliament, I decided to go to the Envy Committee. So it's the environment and also health now, surprisingly an important one agenda too. And why I did that? I did it because I expected, and I was totally right, that this is going to be the largest political battleground. And look, somehow I'm coming back to my usage because I studied geography and ecology. I even studied the climatology, but it was in the mid of 80s, and I'm even I love nature. I'm ornithologist as one of my key hobbies, and I'm really doing something for protecting the birds. But this what's happened in Europe. It's again, this agenda, the green agenda, is naturalist agenda, is totally hijacked by the left. And, I believe that we should restore the balance here. And that's the reason why I put together the publication. Unfortunately, Roger Scruton has already passed away, but he has written a couple of years ago a really nice essay about, that the environment is not the left; it's the conservative agenda. We should conserve something. We are not the owners of everything in the world. It's just a trusteeship, and we should preserve the richness to as the heritage to our sons, to our grandsons and granddaughters. So conservative policy is responsible towards nature, but it's not alarmist. It believes that the human being is able to fix the problems without the hysteria, and to do it according to the rules of the market economy, and to preserve the freedom of the human individual as well as the society. And here, that's the subject of this collection of essay. I provided some kind of a more political or introductory essay on the beginning, defending the conservative stance of and ideas in the environmental policy, and then inviting a lot of scientists, from the major branches, climate, zoology, the water specialist, the energy specialist. And I think it's nice and very important reading, bringing back the reasons to the game. And the reasons is what we are terribly missing in the EU right now with regards to Green Deal. The Green Deal is fundamentally unbalanced, I think. It has four legs: decarbonization, preserving the biodiversity, reforming our industrial agriculture towards more friendly nature friendly, and finally the circular economy. But the reality is that it's now everything about decarbonization. It became the ideology. And while for example, in preserving the biodiversity, we are lagging behind. With the reforming agriculture, we are lagging behind. And why? Here is the problem that some big businesses who are engaged in energy, who are engaged in automotive industry, they have already gave up to defend the rational interest because, with this extensive regulation or even creating some kind of a monopoly, like for example, in the electro-automotive industry, they're fine. They will have their gains assured. But, the consumer will have to pay in 5 to 10 years. It will cause a revolution, I am afraid. On the other hand, in agriculture, there are the farmers with their tractors, with their muds and the pitchfork in the streets, and that's something where the politicians are afraid. Thus, there is no reform of CAP as was promised. Just recently. All those parts of the green establishment has voted against this because they are afraid. And it's unfair, it's imbalance. That's, I guess, the first fundamental problem. And the second fundamental problem is who is going to pay for this. And look, every rational person in the beginning of this year, once we were hit by the COVID strike, believed that we should accommodate our targets according to the prospect of the economies, and unfortunately this has not happened at all. On contrary, they used the COVID as a kind of a ficus leaf for the ambitious green program. They understood that the people would not support financing this green ideology in a such massive way in the time when they have to take every coin twice in their wallets. So what they did is they exploited this fear of pandemics in a way of promoting the green ideology. And I think it's very unfair. We should play this more fairly with the people. And if we are going to continue like this, I'm afraid that it can have a devastating effect on the social life in Europe. And look, we have seen this already in France when they were trying, to raise the taxes for the petrol, and the yellow streets were immediately in the streets. So now, they all have the nice talks, but once they would be confronted with the angry people, I'm really interested how they would behave.
Well, this is a very enlightening way to look at it, and one that isn't widely covered when the EU kind of launches into discussions of its green ambitions. You rarely hear the kind of criticisms that you've raised, right? The power of big corporate interests, the lack of a balance, as you called it, between the different priorities.
And I can show you one example. I remember 15 years ago, everybody was pushing for biofuels. The Greens were pushing that very much everywhere in Europe. And, there was a law of unintended consequences in a classic form, that this kind of a regulation has led to those yellow seeds fields in Europe, to the plantations of palm trees in Brazil or in Indonesia or Malaysia. And what is the effect? That we have a problem with insects and small birds in Europe. We have the problem with survival or orangutans and other animals in the tropical forest because due to this kind of a green ideology, they have lost their natural habitats.
Mm.
And now we are pushing China, to declare the carbon neutrality in 2060. And they said, yeah, okay, but we will build a huge dam just under the slopes of Himalaya, which can have a devastating effect on Assam. There is one of the remaining reservation protecting the rhinos, for example. And it could have a devastating effect and it could cause the conflict between India and China. So be careful. Do not put the ideological framework for every problem of the world. It will not work. I am coming of the communist country and know how this kind of ideologies could have a devastating effect on the society.
Yeah, you're vaccinated, Mr. Vondra, against the seductive lure of ideology, as anyone who has really lived under totalitarianism can be. But this was really great that we got to touch into something that's so close to your heart. I wanted to turn to something that you've dedicated so much of your recent career to, mainly defense issues, foreign policy, the transatlantic relationship. We were mentioning towards the start that very early on in the early days of Czechoslovakia first, and then the independent Czech Republic, you advised Václav Havel on foreign policy issues. You've been an ambassador, then more recently you've been defense minister, and we seem to be in the EU at a very special moment when it comes to foreign policy and foreign issues. We've got now this whole sort of debate about strategic autonomy, what President Macron has called strategic autonomy. And I know that you've, for many, many years, before this was even a term of art, you've been a staunch advocate of defense preparedness, enhancement of military capabilities. You've done it, as you mentioned earlier, with NATO expansion in the early days of Central Europe, joining the alliance, and you've kept on doing it in successive years. But we now seem to have this debate, and I wonder kind of where do you fall on the spectrum, right? When people speak of strategic autonomy, we've got President Macron kind of laid out his vision, and it seems like different people understand it in different ways. So I was hoping to get maybe your perspective on it and how you understand the concept.
Well, I strongly disagree with the idea of strategic autonomy. In fact, I'm in the process of writing a book now, and the working title is AntiMacron. And this is not because I would not be able to sleep without thinking about Macron or his normal standard politician. I respect that he was elected by the French people, but he's making one mistake. He's trying, and that's in a certain French tradition, they are still mourning over, the departure of the great French Empire. And now they want to use the EU as a driver to build another empire, to build a superpower. But it will not work. It will fail because Europe is too diverse continent, too, rich with the various cultures, religions, nations, languages. So we don't and will not have a political nation which would put the empire together. All the empires had a short life in the past, since Charles the Great until, the last attempts like Napoleon or even some Germans. So, and it did not cause anything good. So, my vision of Europe is entirely different from Macron's. I would keep, this competitive cooperation of the various states within, according certain rules of the internal market. That's what they have in Renaissance in Italy. That was a driver for innovation, Leonardo da Vinci and all those great minds. Forget about the strategic autonomy. That's just a dangerous game, which can nail can destroy NATO. can destroy our cooperation with the US. It can destroy transatlantic cooperation, because if the US would translate this effort of the EU to achieve the strategic autonomy, then the American president will say, look, okay, so you are doing this on your own, so go ahead. We will not spend any dollars anymore because you do not need that. This will not work. First we can destroy something what really proved in the history to be very useful to protect European freedom against the various totalitarian temptation like communism or Nazism. So it's number one. And number two, we are all facing the similar challenges now, this rise of China and others. And it's certainly better to do this in duo than alone. And finally, strategic autonomy, if you want to build a superpower, even, if everybody in Europe would agree, and I opposed, I think that the people would not agree with that. But even if they would agree, it would require, to have some kind of artifacts of this kind of a strategically autonomous superpower, for example, nuclear guns. And I do not see any will across Europe. We are now trying, to find in the environmental policy that, look, yes, okay, it makes a sense to decarbonize our energy, but we cannot do this without a use of the nuclear power, because wind, sun, it's unstable. But all those Greens, they are against. They are against. And look, their vision, if you are talking with the Greens, Bas Eickhout, he's one of the leaders there in the European Parliament. He's a smart guy. We disagree on everything, but he's a driver of many issues. So I had a conversation with him. Look, I said, Bas, I would support your, greater integration in Europe in exchange for your support for nuclear energy.
You didn't want it.
Because that's the way how to play the big game. And without the peaceful use of nuclear energy, you are not able to keep the military one. And he said, no, I don't want to play these big games. I want to play the small games. So, you have Europe crowded with the people who wants to play the small game and at the same time to be strategically autonomous superpower. It would not work. Just last example, vaccination. Everybody was arguing that if we go together with the vaccination, we would be strong and first. What is the reality? It's being produced in the UK, it's being produced in the US, it's being produced in China, in Russia, but not in the EU. And the vaccination has started, not just in the US, UK, Russia, and China. It started also in Canada, it started in Israel, it started in Dubai and Bahrain. Europe? No way, did not start yet. So look, it's too bureaucratic entity that, to play a real powerhouse, I can't imagine. That's the way to nowhere.
Well, that's a very interesting perspective, and it asks a lot of important questions that just simply have not been on the debate when this whole issue has kind of been translated into the European news cycle. There never really has been a question of what is this going to entail, right? And is Europe ready? So I appreciate you made some of those things clear from the get-go. And then we've got maybe just a few more minutes, Mr. Vondra. Before we let you go, you have another commitment. Obviously, these are busy days for remote engagement through video conferencing and whatnot. But just before we let you go, I wondered if we could maybe get your quick take, something very brief, on another initiative that you were also very heavily involved in. From the early days, this was another of the late Václav Havel's kind of crusades or pet projects that he sought to push through in the 90s. But then you've also been very involved with this issue. You partook in the Prague Declaration on European Conscience and Communism, and this sort of idea of condemning the crimes of communism, all of the great suffering and the criminal acts that were committed throughout east of the Iron Curtain, much of which you lived yourself. You were imprisoned, and I wonder if kind of how do you see that conference? I believe was about 12 years ago. Do you see the realistic prospect of the EU ever making a clear statement that as a bloc we condemn the crimes of communism and we warn future generations of the potential danger of that specific ideology?
Well, I'm a little bit skeptical. I have to tell you that, EU had a chance. For example, when it was opening this so-called museum of the European history in front of the European Parliament in Brussels. But it was a missed opportunity, because if you go there, and I was there twice just to show to my friends, what the dangerous trends in the EU we can see. Those rooms are filled with Karl Marx, with Friedrich Engels, with the rosy picture of the life in the communist DDR. And it's hardly you can detect a mentioning of Václav Havel, mentioning of John Paul II, Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, nowhere to be seen. So look, Reagan, nowhere to be seen. So, this is how Western Europe see the legacy of the 20th century. And here Europe is divided. Half of Europe, the one from which I came, has a living experience what the communism means. We were in prison, we really had to fight. In fact, you can be critical about Viktor Orban or Lech or Jaroslav Kaczynski or Mateusz Morawiecki, but those are the people who have a living experience with fighting the communists. The father of Mateusz Morawiecki, the current Polish prime minister, he was the leader of the underground Solidarity. In the underground, they were the secret police were pushing this young Mateusz as a son of the colonel to tell them where the father is, and he did not tell. Those are the guys who have proved by their lives, what does it mean to fight for the freedom. It's entirely different from the living experience of Emmanuel Macron or Ursula von der Leyen or Joseph Borrell. And here, unfortunately, the Western Europe has some experience with Nazism, but does not have any direct experience with the communism. And that goes again to the double standard, that, the communist ideas are coming back to the surface in many Western European countries. They don't call them communists, they call them, the green socialists, but it's the same. Today just I had some teleconference in our committee. We are building some kind of a legislation, and suddenly there was a sentence that we should design the appropriate price. I said, look, what does it mean, that appropriate price? It's done by the market. You want to legislate a price? That's a communist idea. But they don't understand it, So the conference which you have mentioned, it had one goal, to show to the Europeans that they were not able yet, to come with the terms of the legacy of the communism. And yes, it's hard, it's difficult, but we have to do it somehow. because otherwise there is a real danger that it can come again. And you know, it did not go from Russia. Marx, Engels, they came from Western Europe. Lenin was approaching, uh, uh, Petersburg from Switzerland, funded by the Western European money, German one in particular. So, look, it's a danger which is at home, not somewhere abroad. And in fact, yes, of course, with Stalin, they merged this communist Western idea with the totalitarian praxis of the Siberian autocracy, and built, a really devastating system. But we should be careful in just labeling that this is something, what was outside of us. No, the roots were growing here, and we should be careful.
Right at home. Well, that was a really wonderful note to end on. Well, I guess a really sad and gloomy note to end on, but a great way to wrap up our conversation. We're so grateful, Mr. Vondra, that you've graced us with more time than we'd agreed to, and you've been very generous. So really a pleasure having you on Rediscovering Conservatism and discussing all of this with you. And we look forward to our audience joining us for another episode. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Have a nice day. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you, Mr. Vondra. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, Alberto is now going to wrap up the recording. And again, thank you so much, because I know you're cycling through different conferences, so we really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, now I have a quick time for a lunch, and then to prepare for another teleconferences. I have two of them today.
Oh gosh.
One is with Anna Fotyga. It's the Poles, on the memory of General Kuklinski, who was this famous defector. And the second one is about the legacy of Václav Benda, who was one of the famous Czech dissidents. And it's done in a cooperation with some Polish and British foundation, because they are going to publish his memoirs. So.
Well, this has been so great, Mr. Vondra. Thank you so much, and best of luck with both of those.
Thanks. Take care. Goodbye.
Take care. Thank you.